So yesterday, if you guys were here, someone on the panel said display advertising is dead. And I think the oxygen got sucked out of the room because that's what we all do for a living, right? So I wanted to open up the panel by asking, show of hands, how many of you agreed with that? Okay, nobody. So that was pretty much the reaction yesterday. So after that, we went and we said, well, maybe not the animated flashy display ads are dead, but the static display ad with no, nothing, that's dead. However, by ad blocking, we've seen that the customer does not like that animated flashy ad and they prefer the more boring one. So that's kind of what we're talking about today, is how do we combat that dead display ad without being annoying to the customer while, enhancing their experience. So guys, I want you to go ahead and introduce yourself and then maybe in a minute or less, give us your overall view of programmatic advertising and the challenges the industry faces in creating a better user experience.
Sure, I'll start. I'm Deniz Kahriman. I work at Quigley Simpson as Associate Director of Digital Media. So for programmatic, I think it's one of the best things that happened to digital, not just display, native, social, connected TV. Right now we have more control over pretty much everything than we ever had before. And I think overall programmatic improved user experience because with the HTML5 adoption and with the standardizing the ads, we have less rendering issues, better page load times. So I think overall it helped with the technical side of the ads, and I think a lot of people treat programmatic as like the stepchild, but I think programmatic, just overall. It's just part of display mostly, and people have these negative experiences, and it's not the fault of programmatic. It's just the overall advertising marketplace.
Jim Napolitano from Organic. I think I'm the creative agency representative on the panel here today. So to answer your question, I do think that there's still a role for display. But I think as marketers, I think that we can do a much better job. I think that in our hunger to serve the brands and their goals and objectives, I think we've forgotten about the role of the consumer and the need for us as marketers to think about how our brands are solving the consumer's problem. I think that we've forgotten about the role of empathy and the importance of being a utility for our consumer. I read a study recently that talked about 82% of consumers see ads as disruptive in their experience. That's amazing. It's astounding, terrifying. And if you think of display as a way to kind of ignite that relationship with a consumer and your first touch with them in many places, we're doing a poor job. And what can we do to better hone in on what that consumer needs, and as brands look for ways that we're introducing ourselves in a way that is engaging them, entertaining them, and ultimately understanding their needs and solving for them.
Great. So good morning, I think. I'm Orchid Richardson, and I lead the IAB's Data Center of Excellence, where we're focused on industry-wide standards and setting up things like ads.txt, which I'm sure all of you are using. And we're doing some really interesting work in data integrity and quality and transparency as it relates to how we all sell media programmatically. I think the exciting thing that I'm most excited about at Programmatic is as the technology gets smarter and people develop in-house expertise on how to use it and to their benefit, there's really the opportunity to improve how measurement and attribution plays an important role in it, so that it's not just about last-click attribution, but really understanding how programmatic impacts the entire life cycle of a campaign, and there's a lot of upper funnel activity that we can take advantage of. I'm also excited about, in terms of the opportunities as it relates to programmatic, is how we can leverage personal prime time. So understanding the user where they are at that moment in time, and when they are or may not be receptive to an ad, or that piece of content that we're trying to serve them. So that's my opinion.
My name is Daniel Rushton. I am a Director of Solutions Consulting at Publicis Media, which I like to say is the world's most generic job title. But essentially, my team is a group of internal consultants that try to stay on the front lines of the programmatic space. We work a lot with the IAB. And then as new trends come out, things like ads.txt, we help to kind of cascade that information out to the agencies and help them kind of run their businesses in a more sophisticated, more intelligent way. So my sort of take on programmatic from where I sit is, in some ways I think we need to give ourselves a little bit of credit that it's still a very, very young space. We've only been doing this for decade tops, and we're still trying to figure things out. And the discussion we had yesterday about pricing dynamics, we don't even know, have a firm idea of what the pricing model ought to be. So there is still sort of some growing pains, I would say, we're going through. But as we start to see, brands get more sophisticated, as the agencies start to get more sophisticated, and as an industry, I think we get a little bit stronger. We'll start seeing more brands like the Dell sort of example we saw today that are really focusing on that personalization, how I engage my consumers in both programmatic media, but also sort of owned properties, et cetera, in a real customized, sort of personalized way. And that, I think, is a better consumer experience. So I think there's a lot of work to do, but I'm actually still very hopeful and very excited about the space.
Awesome. Well, Orchid, I think you mentioned something about using that data that we're collecting to then enhance the user experience. Could you elaborate on that and kind of talk about how you think that would go?
Yeah. So. So there's this concept about personal prime time, and the IAB recently did a study, and so I encourage you all to read it. But at a high level, what it says is that users are readers of content, or people who are consuming content, are willing to understand and accept advertising based on where they are in the moment, right? So if I'm trying to read a piece of content that's less than 240 characters versus a long-form article that may be several pages long, my relationship and my interaction with the ad experience is different. I don't want to see a big pop-up that comes on top of my content if I'm only interested in reading a 240-character piece of content, versus if I'm reading several pages of content, there's an opportunity to introduce ads throughout the break in the experience as you're reading it. Similarly with video, right? If I want to watch a video snippet that's a piece of content that's only 15 seconds, why would I want to see a 30-second pre-roll before I get to that piece of content? And so it's really about understanding, leveraging the data that we collect about users, where they are in the transaction funnel, to make sure that we're serving the right ad at the right time alongside the right piece of content so that the user experience is more seamless.
And if I can jump in and just say, let's be honest, and many of us are doing this today for lots of different brands around the world. It's a growing challenge because the data that we're looking at today is growing exponentially. And so honing in on the right data so that we can understand those signals and make sure that we're, like, for the creative agency, that's a serious challenge. Because how many different permutations on a message, how can we slice it up, even in a dynamic world where we're generating messages, looking for really smart ways that we're able to hone in and understand what are those variables that are going to have the biggest impact to connect and ultimately motivate the consumer is a challenge. And how are we able to work with the brands to understand what they're trying to accomplish, and more importantly, tune in to that consumer need state and understand what they're trying to accomplish in a way to deliver content that's actually going to be meaningful.
Awesome. To kind of build off that, and you have that creative background, do you think that this is going to take pulling in the creative earlier, and so this programmatic is kind of a foreign thing to some of our offices where the creative sits on one side and we are somewhere completely different, maybe not as collaborative as we should be? Do you see programmatic evolving where we're pulling the creative in earlier, and how do you think that should go involving your team?
No, my advice would actually be to leave creative out as long as possible, and don't communicate to them until about a week before the deadline. That's when we produce our best work. I do think that we all grew up in a world where you are developing content as a square peg that fits in a square hole, and frankly, we historically have waited for that buy to be thrown over the fence, and then we pray that the client brief makes sense and that we actually have the ability to deliver on it. I do think that the world we're evolving to is much more collaborative, where I think you need to have really smart analysts that are looking at the data and understanding the data. I think you need to have planners that are super thoughtful in terms of what the brand's trying to accomplish and how that data can inform it. I think pulling the actual creative people in to think about not only from a design perspective, but even for UX. And reality is that this is likely just the tip of the iceberg in terms of engagement with the brand. And I think that great creatives are thinking about it for that whole consumer experience. And how are we creating a continuity of messaging and all the other things they're trying to accomplish. And then technology and all the other pieces. So yes, absolutely. I think that this has turned into a team sport, and I think we need to be really smart in the way that we're leveraging all the different super talented people that have to make this effective to work.
So we have a slightly different approach. So we're an integrated agency, so we start working with the creative team right away. We share our data about the audiences, what they like, what they're into, so they can, the creative team can come up with the best message possible. Mm-hmm. And like you mentioned, it's the whole user journey, so like the first impression is very important, and you don't want to show up with the very strong call to action. You want to make sure that you connect with that person first. So definitely we work with the creative team very, very closely.
Awesome, awesome. Kind of linking the two together where we're delivering the message at the right time, but also keeping creative in mind. How do you guys see it going? Like, are we going to have 25 different versions of creative to talk to the same person? Or is your brand across the board? And like, kind of how do you see that going?
So I'll just say I'm not the creative person, I'm the data person. so I may have a slanted view about this, but I think even before we get to the creative portion and development, we have to define what the campaign KPI is, and I think oftentimes those two things are disconnected from each other. And when you figure out what's the KPI that you're trying to hit for a particular campaign, that will define how many types of creative that you need in order to hit that particular goal. Oftentimes what happens is the creative team makes awesome creative, and it will pull out an emotion, it will get you, motivated about something, but it doesn't necessarily drive a sale. And so if the KPI of a campaign is that at the end of after this campaign, we've driven 100 new subscriptions, or they've done something, some kind of transaction, that the creative team needs to know that. And I think oftentimes that gets disconnected in the funnel.
Steve made a comment earlier that was interesting, and the question was about as marketers were hyper fixated on the consumer journey. And as we think about what those consumer profiles look like, do we see less or more? From my experience, it's more and more and more and more. And the more we're able to understand the nuances between them, the more effective I can develop creative that's going to deliver on what they're looking to accomplish. But that does become a serious challenge for brands, because last I checked, they actually don't have endless budgets for me to go keep creating more stuff. And so the result of that, though, is us being really smart, prioritizing on who are the key profiles that we want to solve for. But the shift change in that is, years ago, this conversation would have been us watering down and having more of a generic conversation or message out in hopes that it's appealing to a broader group. And I would argue that today, deeper understanding of the consumer gives us the ability to focus on the right consumer with the perfect message, as opposed to broad scale. So it's a smarter use of a brand's dollars. And so no, I don't know that we're going to exponentially be creating more and more creative, or at least not more and more effective creative, but I think we can be smart in who we're trying to talk to.
Well, and I think there are ways that we can kind of, avoid asking creative to just build out 100 different, versions of the same ad in a kind of customized way. And we're seeing, movement and strengthening in sort of the DCO space. And so there are ways where you can leverage technology, and I think that's the promise of programmatic is, if you can come up with the basic story, but then we can have 50 permutations of that, that we can kind of hopefully starting with the data, map out what would be a unique story for somebody who is millennial and is young and just starting out in life versus a baby boomer. They're really interesting sort of approaches that we can take that actually don't exponentially increase the work on creative, but just relies on more of a templatized sort of approach and a structured sort of thought process there. So I hope that's where we're going. I did see some numbers recently that it's something like only 30% of programmatic creative is dynamic, which is a little disappointing. So I think we do need to keep working on that front, though.
Awesome. Well, on a little bit of a different note, so both Apple and Google have released their ad blockers to their browsers. I think Google released theirs last week. We come to the question, how is that going to change our industry when we can't scale our campaigns? Is an ad blocker really the solution here to creating that better user experience? And how do you think that it's going to change our industry? Daniel, maybe?
Sure. I mean, in the long term, I don't think ad blocking is going to be sustained. If you're a publisher, and I'm sure there are a decent number of publishers here, like I used to work on the supply side, publishers are being squeezed. They're really struggling, and it is expensive to generate good content. It's not easy or cheap to build a really high quality piece of content. So they have to find a way to monetize somehow. And so they're going to keep fighting back against whether it's Google or Apple. We might get more of a focus on native content, or we might get more of a focus, the creative might change, but publishers need to monetize. And that's a reality that I don't think is ever going to go away.
We bring up a good point mentioning publishers. Do you think they also play a role in creating this better experience, and in what ways do you see that happening?
Oh, absolutely. I think it's something that they have to face directly, that if people are turning on ad blockers, if they are trying to kind of tune out from your site, what's the reason for that? And if your approach is autoplay videos on every single page that are going to scream at consumers, that may not be a sustainable or a healthy approach from a publisher's perspective. I think we have seen a shift more towards native advertising where, yes, the message gets embedded a little bit more in the context. It fits the environment, and consumers seem to engage with that a little bit better. So.
Awesome. One thing we talked about earlier was how we want to bring this great value to all of our clients, but at the end of the day, we have to meet our clients' goals. And a lot of the times that is direct response. So how do you walk that line? Deniz, maybe?
Yeah, so like I mentioned before, it's, like if we want to get more conversions, we need to know where the user is along the customer journey. So you can't just, use a very strong CTA for the first impression. You have to dial it back. And then you have to measure, you have to see where they are exactly, and then adjust that message. At the end of the day, if you are pushing them towards the end of the funnel, then you'll get more conversions. So actually, at the end of the day, you'll have better KPIs.
Awesome. Daniel, do you have a take on that?
Sure. We were actually talking about this at breakfast earlier. And to my point, at the start of the conversation, I think this is where we are seeing the industry evolve, and the fact that this is a young piece of the business, where a lot of people, even to this day, only view programmatic as a DR approach to the market. Mm-hmm. And I think it's always going to play that role. It's a powerful thing when you've put something in my shopping cart and I know that you are that close to converting. Yeah, I want to hit you with that final retargeting message. But I think there's so much potential to move up the funnel and to really get creative about how we talk to consumers in that basic sort of brand awareness stage, or how we talk to them as they move into the consideration stage. So I think there's a lot of potential for us to kind of expand the world of programmatic there.
I agree, and I do think, we talk about the journey, we talk about understanding, the broader experience for a consumer, and I think the more that we can think about it in terms of a multi-touch, long-term relationship, the more effective creatively we can unfold that story for the consumer.
Yeah, I'd just like to add, there are some really interesting brands, direct-to-consumer brands today that are actually doing it. They take the opportunity to have the transaction, monetize the last click, but then they use the data that they collect and the interaction to help build a relationship with the advertiser. So there are brands like Away, which is the luggage company. Once you buy a bag, they create this whole experience around the fact that you have their luggage. or Warby Parker, the eyeglass company, how they're leveraging data to build their brand. So I really think there's a huge opportunity, to your point, beyond just the last click and the direct response, but to use that direct response advertising or experience to help build the overall brands and create new brand loyalty and find new audiences.
I think I work in politics, which is so fun, but we do a similar thing where it's like, oh, you're familiar with us. Oh, we have your email. Oh, thank you for signing up. Will you donate now? And kind of walking them through that experience. And I think we'll see brands shift that way as well, more and more. You know, we've talked a lot about the flaws of programmatic advertising, but I also kind of want to point out, like, hey, like, what's good about it, what's working, and kind of where do you see the future going in that? Deniz?
I think DCO is one of the things, like we all mentioned before. I think we really need to take advantage of programmatic because right now a lot of advertisers are just using programmatic because it's cheaper and because of scale. But we need to make sure that, you know, we are leveraging dynamic creative or the audience data because right now we have like so much data, not just audiences. You can, you know, optimize campaigns based on weather or exchange rate. So it's all about being creative with what we have and really using all of the controls, especially for brand safety and fraud, because like all the controls are there. It's all about using them.
Just to build on that, I would also say we've created an environment that there is so much tremendous noise out there. The stat I shared at the beginning of 82% seeing it disruptive just underscores the noisy environment we've created, and the need to break through, in my opinion, is all about relevance. I think as marketers, we need to have tools that give us the ability to make more meaningful connections, and I think that programmatic and better targeting is a step in the right direction, but I think that we need to work harder and bring the ball further down.
I agree. We've talked a lot about brands bringing programmatic in-house, but how does that kind of combat the user experience? You know, we're the agencies, we do this all day. If brands are bringing this in-house, is that going to hinder that experience? Orchid, maybe?
So I think if brands bring it in-house, they also have to bring the expertise in-house. The challenge is that from where I sit, oftentimes it's hard to find people to run the programmatic desk who are really smart, who understand the analytics behind it, who know how to pull the triggers. So if brands are going to bring this in-house, then they really need to invest in the people as well as their technology, but they really have to invest in the right people to help manage that in-house technology. I think the reasons why we go to agencies is because that's where the expertise lies.
I would also just build on that, Orchid, and say that this is changing so rapidly that I work with a lot of clients that are talking about and playing with that model, and the challenge is that with an in-house system, the beauty of an agency model is that you've got lots of talented people like Danial that are experiencing this and driving it for a huge client base, and that gives him a world of best practice to be able to introduce to his clients. And when you have a homegrown in-house system, you just limit your visibility into other worlds and other success stories.
Yeah, and that's actually something we talk to our clients about quite often as we're having these conversations is, you know, if you're going to run in-house, I mean, on top of the challenges of staffing and on top of the challenges, how do you keep up to date with the industry? And are you going to send your staff of 3 people to IAB events every month, like when they're supposed to be optimizing campaigns? Like, it's hard. It's a difficult thing to do. But then there is that perspective that, you know, at Publicis, we sit on data from literally around the world, from clients from across different verticals, and we have some insights that literally just no brand could ever get on their own. They don't have that perspective, and I do think there's value in that agencies can bring to the table. I don't know that we always do the best job of like bubbling that up to our clients, and that's probably an area that we need to work on. But I think there's value there.
Yeah, definitely. I think a big challenge that you mentioned is explaining that programmatic experience, and I think that is why brands are trying to bring it in-house, because maybe it's something that's not understood, it's not as transparent. Another thing we talked about was, having this better experience is going to cause CPMs to go up. You're going to have to pay a higher price for this inventory. And I mean, just as with connected TV that we just heard, it's cheaper right now, but as more people buy into it, it's going to get expensive. How do you guys see that going, Deniz?
Right now, there's a shift towards private exchanges, mostly because of the brand safety issues. But in my experience, we try to use whitelists rather than working directly with the publishers because it's way cheaper and you still have the full control over what you're delivering. And you're still getting really, really high scale. So that's like what we recommend to our clients. So that is like another approach, so you can still keep the CPMs low.
Yeah, I think a lot of it comes down to what you're trying to do with an individual campaign as well. And I think very often, going back to the sort of growing pains we had as an industry, we started as sort of that, kind of remnant play that, like from the publisher side, this was remnant inventory. From the buy side, this is my scale play. It's low cost, et cetera. But if you really want to get to a personalized journey, if you really want to find the right consumer in the right moment at the right place, that actually is a premium experience. And I think we need to start thinking about, do we re-message the programmatic world as, at least in some use cases, a premium environment that's going to cost you more money, but you're going to get better value out of it? And so can we rethink that this is not just a cheap play? This has to be something else.
Yeah, absolutely. Does anyone in the audience have any questions for us?
Oh. No, it's back. I'm sorry. Hello, my name is LaShonda. I'm from Tribune Online Content, formerly Tribune Publishing. Deniz, you made a comment that struck my soul. Because as a publisher, working in the private marketplace and programmatic guarantee space, I often hear this kind of pushback from buyers where they say, oh, efficiency cost, means the most to them, so they go into the open exchange and they do whitelisting. One thing that we found as a publisher is that it's not a surefire way to make sure that you are hitting that premium inventory at a cheaper rate. So my question to you is, what are you doing to ensure that even though you whitelisted, you know that that's the site that you're landing on? And I say that because we did a test in which we turned off our ad server and searched for our inventory and was able to buy it. So you have domain spoofing, you have arbitraging of the inventory where you think you're buying pre-roll, but you're buying in-banner video. So what precautions are you taking when you're whitelisting in the open exchange to combat price?
Yeah. So we have a team just for programmatic, and that team, like literally all day long, they pull reports. And we look at the publisher performance very often just to see like how they're doing. And like you said, it's not perfect, but at the end of the day, if we're getting what we want to get in terms of our CPA goals and or conversion volume, then we will just say keep doing what we're doing, and then we add like more sites, more publishers, and if we see any issue, we always have these relationships with the publishers so we can work with them, and then that's an opportunity for them because they can come back and say, hey, like this is what you're seeing in the programmatic, but we can do this and that so we can avoid these issues, or we can provide you a better like an ad experience for your brand. So we work with them to make sure that we're getting what we want.
I mean, it's a difficult problem, and we actually do a fair amount of work in the PMP space, but at the same time, we really work with anyone who's in the open exchange to make sure they've got verification vendors in place. We're really supportive of like the ads.txt initiative. I think that's a great way of cutting out some domain spoofing. So we're working on multiple fronts to try to address those problems because it's a problem for the publishers and it's a problem for our buyers. If I'm a client and somebody comes to me and says, hey, you know what, you thought you were running on Tribune and instead, we know for a fact that was fraudulent inventory. That's not a good conversation. That's not something we want to have happen. So we do try to work on that on multiple fronts when we can.
So one thing that you guys haven't talked a ton about are the data infrastructures behind you. So are you guys just optimizing as a buyer? Or do you guys have data science teams behind you? Because I feel like there's so much metadata, and we haven't really talked a lot about, you know, all of that behind just the standard DSP pulling that data. The gentleman before talked a lot about the personalization, but how are you guys, what does your infrastructure look like behind you in terms of your support system that's pushing back the segments to your DSP to you know, better the user experience?
I can answer this. So for us, for example, we work with different programmatic partners. For instance, Trade Desk, they have their own team, so we work with them. So if we have any like ideas that we come up with for a specific campaign, we just go and, you know, like talk to them and get their own ideas, their recommendations. So I feel like it's more like a teamwork rather than just like us like advertisers like setting up the campaigns. That's how we approach it.
Yeah, and on our side of the house, we, you know, Publicis is an interesting structure, in which I could spend an hour talking about just the org chart there, but we do have a lot of resources. Like the campaigns are actually run at the agency level. They have analytics teams that support them at that level. We also have an analytics group at the Publicis media level looking at sort of more of this meta trend. So we are trying to look at the bigger ecosystem when we can.
And from the data centers, we are having an industry-wide initiative where we're trying to standardize data so that when you say coupon clippers and I say coupon clippers, we're all talking about the same thing in terms of recency, how the data was collected, how old it is. And we're doing that in partnership with some of the larger companies and smaller companies in the industry, from Google to AppNexus. Publicis actually has some representation on that working group. So hopefully by September, we'll have something that we can all standardize around, similar to how we did with ads.txt.
I have two questions. First, oh, I'm sorry. What am I missing? Oh, sorry.
Thank you. So you guys talked about how media services are now coming in-house to the brand side. I also feel like there's a new trend where a lot of the creative services are coming in-house as well. Do you guys have thoughts on this?
Yeah, and we're hearing that and seeing that with lots of clients today as well. And, you know, very much like the comment I made earlier of, you know, brands need to work really hard to cut through the clutter and get attention. And I think that takes the best thinking from data analysts, from media planners, and from creatives. And so does that give the brand the ability to potentially yield cost savings in developing it in-house? Possibly, but are they going to deliver a product that's going to drive longevity for the brand and have forward thinking in terms of everything else they're looking to accomplish down the road, as well as bringing best practice from other industries into play? I think that's where brands will see this as a short-term solution. My perspective on it, and what I think I've already started to see, is it's a little bit of the pendulum swinging, where I think brands are doing it, and I've seen some experiences where they're starting to peel back and realize that it may not be the most effective model.
I wanted to ask about how much you guys are measuring for context and the value of context. We pay a lot of lip service to environment, but one of the things that Programmatic did from the get-go is it essentially cleaved the ad from the environment and allowed the ad to follow somebody anywhere into any context. And we're talking a lot about the importance of premium environments, but I see very few metrics that really show what is that value of environment. What does a premium environment bring to the impact of an ad, to the value of an ad, to the impact on brand? And I don't see that in the discussions or even in the metrics that I see as a reporter who's constantly reporting on all of the different metrics and analytics that are coming out from everyone. And I'm still waiting for a better assessment of where we are in terms of understanding that. Daniel, to your point about the importance of publishers and those premium environments, I'm not sure that we have a real metric to understand what their value is.
I don't know if we've got one single metric. One thing that we're looking at quite a bit right now is viewable CPMs or viewable CPAs. I think that's starting to get into that contextual environment a little bit, that if I'm buying lots of cheap inventory, but actually when I start to back into how many of these ads were really seen, you know, and on that viewable CPM level, does that make a difference? We actually find that our private marketplace deals tend to outperform the open exchange significantly. So we're starting to look at that. I think we've got a lot more work to be done, but yeah, I think it's a good question.
Yeah, and I'm also curious about if we have a better understanding of how relevance also improves those metrics. So not only just a premium environment, but the right premium environment that puts the user in a particular mindset. If we have a better understanding of that.
That's where we still haven't gotten at this point. I mean, I think the most advanced we have is that sort of viewable CPM or some of those broader metrics. I think it's difficult to try to categorize things as the right context. And I think that becomes a challenge. But I'm sure, especially as we do move up the funnel, it's probably something we're going to start looking at quite a bit more.
Yeah. In the first years of behavior, when companies like Dakota and Revenue Science were doing this, one of the things that they did was actually show how unexpected contexts actually performed better in certain categories. That in fact, the car ad actually did really well in certain contexts that we didn't even understand before we had behavioral to show us that. But that those weird affinities are there, and they're not always in the expected places, but in the unexpected places if we ask the right questions of the data.
Yeah, not that I'm promoting Hearst, but Hearst magazines, Hearst digital magazines, because they have so many different brands in their under their umbrella, they did a study about 4 or 5 years ago to show the correlation between people who went on dates and did Match.com and their need or desire to read food content. So there was a direct correlation between people who were going on a date would go to food.com or foodtv.com and spend time on that site because the idea or the hypothesis was that I was planning for a date and now I wanted to figure out what I was going to cook for my date. And it was like a true correlation between that. So I think that it is something to be had about the unexpected ad in an unexpected place.
Understanding and understanding the context of my comments yesterday about bringing everything in-house, as kind of the landscape shifts from a brand perspective, we view it kind of as user experience. The offsite experience becomes an extension of the onsite experience. And so it's kind of interesting in the agency relationship. How do you see that developing over time where, depending on who controls the content, who controls the buying, if everything offsite is just an extension of onsite, how do you see that future developing? And also, how does that then allow for brands to continue to differentiate amongst their peers?
So we've seen a lot of success in taking a step back and thinking more broadly about the consumer landscape and content ecosystem as a whole. And so, gone are the days where we just think about a single channel at a time, and now we need to think about how they're connecting to each other effectively, not only in terms of pulling that consumer through a singular journey effectively, but also as we're yearning for more content creation efficiency, it's also a really smart way that we can be thinking about ways to create effective content. So I think, thinking about it as not just an individual element and thinking about the bigger picture is a much more effective way to pull that consumer through.
Yeah, and kind of if we're thinking about, I think we're on the same page that we're thinking about it in that same world, but how does the relationship between brands and agencies develop if that world exists?
I mean, it's a great question. I think the agencies, and we're moving this direction, the agencies need to become much more technologically sophisticated. So I think that was a lot of the motivation behind Publicis buying Sapient, is that they specialize more in that owned content sort of world. So trying to bridge that gap then becomes a really important part of the conversation. And actually, we've seen this in a number of new business pitches recently. That becomes the question is, don't just talk to me about my paid media experience, talk to me about the full consumer journey, and how do you plan to connect with the rest of the infrastructure that I'm building on the own content, et cetera. And so those conversations are becoming much more sophisticated and much more complex. But I think the agencies, we have to evolve with that. We have to grow.
And then where does that leave differentiation?
That's
the hard part.
It's difficult. I mean, I still think there will always be a need for an agency to have its own identity. Different brands are looking for different sort of experiences. So even if I say I want my agency to be more connected to whatever's going on my own properties, you know, a Starcom client, you know, we consider them the experience agency. That's very different from a Zenith client who's the ROI agency. So depending on what their needs are, that will translate to sort of different visions. And so I think that's the space for differentiation.
Guys, we have to wrap and move this over to the roundtable, but